Welcome to Around the Empire. I'm your host, Joanne Leon. Author and policy analyst Patrick Eddington joins us today for a wide-ranging discussion about his service in the CIA during the Bush 41 and Bill Clinton eras, about the Gulf War, Russiagate, the failure to change the course of American foreign policy after the Cold War, and about the unsustainability of and America's incompatibility with empire. Patrick Eddington is a policy analyst in Homeland Security and Civil Liberties at Cato Institute. He was an advisor to Representative Holt of New Jersey, and he's an Adjunct Assistant Professor at Georgetown University's Center for Security Studies. Eddington was a military imagery analyst in the CIA's National Photographic Interpretation Center from 1988 to 1996, with assignments that included monitoring the breakup of the former Soviet Union and providing military assessments to policymakers on Iraqi and Iranian conventional forces. Eddington resigned from the CIA in 1996 after working on a book titled Gassed in the Gulf, the inside story of the Pentagon CIA cover-up of the Gulf War syndrome. He also wrote a 2011 memoir titled Long Strange Journey about his years in the CIA. He's been published at many outlets and has opinion pieces at Cato, Just Security, and other sites. We recorded this interview on December 11th, 2018. Pat Eddington, welcome to Around the Empire. It's great to have you.
Good to be with you, Joanne.
So there are a lot of things I'd like to talk to you about today, mainly focused on your experiences and insights due to the fact that you have firsthand experience serving in the government in the CIA during the Bush 41 years. You've written books and articles and shared a lot of information about that time. But just to get started, sort of what the genesis of this interview was something that you wrote on Twitter, a Twitter thread you wrote after Bush 41's death. And that really piqued my interest. And, I wanted to talk to you more about those years and about your thoughts and insights and experiences. Would you mind if I read that thread for our listeners?
Sure, by all means.
I have it here. Or I could share screen and you could read it if you prefer.
Oh, you can go right ahead.
Okay. Alrighty. So it's a Twitter thread. Number 1, the softball memory-free tributes to Bush 41 are flowing freely today, as are the attacks on anyone contradicting the misty-eyed narrative. His presidency was far more consequential, in a negative sense, than any cheerleader will ever admit. 2, that he had physical courage was beyond dispute. His wartime service demonstrated that. That his remaining family mourn him is not the issue. We all mourn those we lose. The idea that we should engage in a selective recollection of his White House years on this day is ludicrous. 3, my strongest memories of Bush 41 come from my time at the CIA during Desert Storm. I was part of an imagery analyst team responsible for reporting on Iraqi military activity during and after the conflict. I remember vividly Bush 41's speech at the Raytheon plant in February 1991. In that speech, he called on the Iraqi people to rise up against Hussein. After the ejection of the Iraqi army from Kuwait, the Kurds and the Iraqi Shiites did exactly that, and Bush 41 refused to give them any military aid whatsoever. No covert action support either. 5, I had the grim duty of reporting on the destruction of Kurdish and Shiite villages by Saddam's remaining Republican Guard forces. Those Kurds and Shiites took Bush 41's call for them to rise up as a sign that he would help them if they did. 6, over the next 2 years, Hussein engaged in a systematic campaign of murder, village destruction, etc., against those who rose up against his rule at the urging of Bush 41. It was shades of Hungary in 1956, Czechoslovakia in 1968 all over again, but far bloodier. 7. Bush also did nothing to address the medical problems of Desert Storm veterans once they began reporting them from late 1991 on. My strongest memories of Bush 41 are of a man who showed none of the honor or decency being attributed to him today. That's how I'll remember him. And the last one, I devoted years to helping Desert Storm veterans who Bush 41 abandoned. And I've watched as the war he set in motion helped lay the groundwork for the regional chaos and bloodshed we see today. No, I won't engage in the whitewashing of his record today or any other day. So, first of all, I appreciate the fact that you didn't wait to test the water. You spoke your mind, you spoke your truth, and to me, I admire that.
Thank you.
Do you want to expand on any of that?
Yeah, sure. And that's, I was motivated, obviously, by, I just have to be blunt, what I perceive to be essentially almost an imperial Roman kind of celebration, if you will, that went on literally for a week over this man. And I thought that the hagiographic tributes that you were seeing, not just on the Fox News channel, which would be kind of the usual suspect for this kind of stuff, but on all major media, certainly all major corporately funded or controlled media, we were seeing this just literally ad nauseum. And I think it was just the PBS NewsHour, probably also Amy Goodman, I would imagine, on Democracy Now! As well, but of what I would call kind of the establishment media. The only really decent piece I saw was on the NewsHour with Judy Woodruff, where there was actually, a little bit more coverage about, for example, Iran-Contra and his essentially denials about being in the loop on anything having to do with that, and then also the consequences of the Gulf War and the failures there. Not in as much detail as I would have preferred to have seen, but at least they did something. But they were the only major outlet that I saw that really did anything. And so that motivated me not just to do this Twitter thread that you just read on air, but it motivated me to do, a much larger piece for justsecurity.org that was actually published on Pearl Harbor Day, December 7th, in which I kind of expanded on these themes. And I will say that, I began my life, as a Republican. I grew up in Southwest Missouri, Springfield, Missouri specifically, which is in the 7th Congressional District in the state of Missouri, and it is about as red a district as they come. And I remember going kind of door to door at the age of 17 in 1980, campaigning essentially, for the first time and on my own dime, obviously, for Ronald Reagan. I wasn't able to vote for him because I wasn't young enough, but I distinctly, remember just having this feeling back then that the country in so many ways was kind of slipping away economically and otherwise. And he seemed to kind of offer this vision essentially of a restored American greatness. And, when you're 17, especially if you're a 17-year-old young man, you tend to be young and stupid, somewhat naive in the ways of the world, but he just kind of struck me that way. And so, the first Reagan term, I felt like I had a lot to cheer about. And then, of course, Iran-Contra comes around, and then I begin to kind of figure out that, maybe things just don't quite work the way that I really expected them to or hoped to or whatever. And so it's the beginning of my political education. And one of the reasons that I actually voted for George Herbert Walker Bush in 1988 was because of his resume. This is a guy who was of my father's generation. My father fought in the Pacific Theater of World War II. He served in the Pacific Theater of World War II, just as Bush did. And so coming out of that generation and growing up essentially in the 60s and the 70s, World War II was still very much a thing. I mean, memories were very vivid, and all the sacrifice that was required of people in this country. And so, a guy like Bush, at least in theory, should have learned, some decent lessons from that. And, he was, a relatively successful businessman in the fossil fuel industry. Went on, of course, to become a member of the House of Representatives. and later to go on to be both an ambassador and, as you pointed out, previously director of the CIA when I was there. I joined the CIA in February of 1988 and then left very publicly in October of 1996, and we can talk about that maybe a little bit later. But for me, one of the seminal moments, was the Gulf War, and I talk about in the just security piece, being at the CIA, working at what was then known as the National Photographic Interpretation Center. It has since been absorbed into what's known as the National Geospatial and Imagery Intelligence Agency, or NGA. And at that time, in the summer of 1990, Saddam Hussein had been basically in a big to-do with his Kuwaiti neighbor, not just the Kuwaitis, other Gulf states too, but the Kuwaitis especially, because Saddam, according to all the accounts that I'd read, was really angry at them for not helping to bail him out of a lot of the debt that he'd accumulated, buying weapons and the like, in order to try to stave off the Iranians during the Iran-Iraq War. And he felt he was basically providing a shield for the Kuwaitis and the other Gulf states, many of whom I should say are majority Sunni Muslim, against Iranian expansionism, or at least the perceived threat of Iranian expansionism. And so he began essentially in the spring of 1990 to issue threats against Kuwait, and this escalated by late July of 1990 into something that had gotten the attention of folks in Washington. And beginning on July 20th, he began transferring elements of his Republican Guard Forces Command, the most elite units in his military. Probably the best way to describe them would be as the equivalent of Adolf Hitler's Waffen-SS formations in World War II, his actual field divisions in World War II, not just a regime security force, although that was their primary function, but they had been his principal offensive combat spearheads during 1987 and 1988 when the Iraqis, with the help of the United States, finally beat the Iranians on the battlefield.
So they were well trained too. They were in shape, per se.
Yeah, well, they were also benefiting from the fact that Saddam Hussein made Iraq the first country in the world to use chemical nerve agents in combat, and that's a big reason why his offensives between April and July of 1988 were so successful. The Iranians simply did not have anything approaching the proper countermeasures, and also from the mid-1980s on, the United States had been supplying fairly detailed intelligence to the Iraqi military and Iraqi intelligence services, which was of great assistance to them, both strategically but also in many battlefield and tactical situations. So we roll around to the summer of 1990, and on August 20th, Saddam begins to send his Republican Guard Forces heavy divisions, his tank and mechanized infantry divisions, down towards the border with Kuwait. And our first tip-off of this was a Allied attaché who was actually making the drive up from Kuwait City to Baghdad, who basically passed all these vehicles, these Republican Guard vehicles, on their way down towards the Basra area in southeastern Iraq. So that attaché's cable is really kind of what got the ball rolling back in Washington to begin retasking various intelligence assets, including our overhead imagery collection systems, to try to figure out exactly what was going on. And at that particular time, I was not directly working the Iraqi problem. I was working some other issues, specifically an uprising, a jihadist uprising, actually, on Trinidad and Tobago that had broken out. But I was consulting with and kind of keeping tabs, helping to keep tabs on the team that was initially working the Iraqi crisis. And my colleagues were writing cables, they were going to the White House. They were going all over the intelligence community, just literally chronicling this massive buildup down at the border with Kuwait. And, reading in the papers, I basically see that the President of the United States, George Herbert Walker Bush, is listening to the late King Hussein of Jordan and the late Egyptian dictator Hosni Mubarak, who are basically telling President Bush, look, this is just a big shakedown. Don't worry about it. Saddam is going to calm down. He's going to extort the Kuwaitis a little bit, but, nothing is going to come of this. And that was the basic message that was being proffered. And President Bush, go ahead.
I'm sorry to interrupt. Um, at the time, the Kuwaitis were also putting a lot of oil out on the market, keeping the prices low,
Yes.
and this also, put pressure on Saddam because he had just had 10 years of war, however long it
Yes.
was, and was in
Yes.
pretty bad economic condition. And
Absolutely.
I mean, I've read that I don't know if it was State Department or whoever, sort of encouraged the Kuwaitis to do that to pressure Saddam.
I can't speak to that. What I can speak to that is on the public record that I have absolutely seen is that on July 25th, our then ambassador to Iraq, April Glaspie, had a meeting with Saddam to discuss issues of mutual interest. And when this entire dispute with Kuwait came up, she made what I consider to be a massive mistake and basically said that, the United States took no position on his dispute with Kuwait. Now, bear in mind that at the time she had her meeting, the Iraqi buildup on the border with Kuwait had been going on now for almost a week. And by this point, there were probably 80,000 Republican Guard troops down on the border. And the reason that those of us who were following this were convinced that he was at least going to lop off the northern part of the Kuwait, where a number of the disputed oil fields were, is that he already had the Iraqi Army Third Corps down in southern Kuwait. So the 51st Mechanized Infantry Division, the Iraqi Third Armored Division, other divisions and other military assets were already down there and were available to him if all the purpose of this was to simply rattle a saber, right, and try to shake him down. But when he made the decision to move his most elite units down to the border, and this included full logistic trains, it included full surface-to-air missile capabilities. I'm not just talking about mobile missiles platforms like the SA-9 or SA-6 that would travel with these Republican Guard tank and mechanized infantry divisions. I'm talking about big missiles, SA-2s, the kinds of things that help to provide like a real bona fide umbrella, essentially, over a force that gives you the ability to kind of go against aircraft at all altitudes, not just low to medium altitudes. And then we saw the stockpiling of supplies as well, ammunition, fuel, things of that nature. So this was the real deal, and it was really, really clear by the last day of July of 1990 that he was going to do something. And, I wasn't the only one who had that feeling. Charlie Allen, at that time, the National Intelligence Officer for Warning, he and his staff had spent literally over a year trying to get their colleagues in the rest of government, but particularly the Bush White House, to pay attention to the fact that Saddam had never really demobilized. He had not really seriously demobilized his military for the most part, and certainly not the Republican Guard. But the president chose to listen to Hosni Mubarak and King Hussein of Jordan. And of course, they were wrong. And in the early morning hours of August 2nd, 1990, Saddam's tanks and mechanized infantry units rolled across the border into Kuwait. And by the morning of July 5th, 1990, lead reconnaissance elements of the Republican Guard had already crossed briefly into Saudi Arabia. Across the Kuwait-Saudi border.
You said Saudi Arabia, you mean Kuwait, right?
Well, they crossed from Kuwait into Saudi Arabia.
Oh, okay, They did?
Yes, briefly, very, very briefly, but they did in fact cross the border. These are the reconnaissance elements. So what they were doing is trying to make sure, essentially, that there were no Saudi armored or mechanized formations right up there on the border, potentially looking to try to intervene.
I see.
And at the same time, and this was the cable that I helped write. I was actually the lead author on this particular cable that morning. At the same time, Saddam had moved the logistics elements for two of his divisions, lead divisions, one armored and one mech, within 10 kilometers of the Kuwait-Saudi border. So you just don't do that, and they were dispersed, against air attack too. We could see all this on the imagery. And for our listeners who might be wondering, gee, is this guy like spilling a whole bunch of stuff that's still classified? The answer is no. All of this stuff is in my book, Long Strange Journey, an Intelligence Memoir, which had to go through the CIA's pre-publication review, prior restraint process, as I like to call it. But it's all based on the cables that I and my colleagues wrote during this particular period of time, and some of which I managed to get at least partially declassified. But in any event, we put out this cable the morning of August 5th, basically saying that Iraqi forces appeared to be staging for follow-on combat operations into Saudi Arabia. Well, that finally got the attention of the president and the Secretary of Defense, Dick Cheney, and the chairman of the Joint Chiefs at the time, General Colin Powell. And before the day was over, those two gentlemen were on an airplane heading over to Riyadh, Saudi Arabia, and they were taking our cables and the briefing boards that we had prepared based on the imagery showing exactly what had been going on. And, the rest is history. King Fahd, of course, completely scared out of his mind that he was next on Saddam's list, immediately agreed to the deployment of American troops. And that's how what was then known as Operation Desert Shield, which was kind of the defensive phase of the operation, actually got underway. And so I spent, the rest of the summer and the fall of 1990 and the winter of 1991 just essentially watching the Iraqis build up their forces further in occupied Kuwait and southern Iraq, as the president mobilized essentially a global coalition to confront Saddam. And you asked me earlier, what are the other things I'll remember him for? I will absolutely remember President Bush for showing tremendous skill in bringing that coalition together. I mean, it was definitely shades of the coalition that FDR and Churchill were able to put together to fight the Nazis and the fascist Japanese and the fascist Italians. The stakes were not quite as high, but the skill that was required to knit all those countries together into some kind of functioning unified front was still considerable. And I think that was one of his finest diplomatic moments. And then when the war actually kicked off, I think he had his very finest diplomatic moment in terms of being able to keep the Israelis from actually getting into the conflict, because folks may not remember, but I remember very vividly that one of Saddam's goals was to try to drag the Israelis into the war, because he thought, correctly in my judgment, that if he could do that, he would then be able to peel off the Egyptians, peel off the Syrians. And the Egyptians and the Syrians had actually committed not insignificant combat forces to the coalition, including ground forces. And President Bush managed to convince Prime Minister Yitzhak Shamir that it was in Israel's interest, as well as the United States' interest and the interest of the coalition, for Israel to refrain from any kind of retaliatory action, at least for the duration of the conflict. So I'll always look at that, quite honestly, as Bush's greatest diplomatic hour, if you will, because if Israel had come into that conflict, then I think the war could have ended very differently. So I definitely give President Bush 41, great credit for that. But you alluded to, or actually read, one of the tweets when I essentially called out what is probably my very strongest memory of him going to that Raytheon Patriot missile plant in Massachusetts in mid-February of 1991 and giving that speech in which he said all that is necessary. I'm paraphrasing now, but this is, I think, a very close paraphrase. All that is necessary for this to end is for the Iraqi people to rise up and overthrow Saddam Hussein. And of course, that is precisely what they did. After combat operations, ground combat operations were over on February 28th, and the Republican Guard was largely destroyed, although not completely, but Iraqi forces had been ejected from Kuwait. The Kurds in the north and the Shiites in the south rose up virtually simultaneously and attempted to do exactly what President Bush had urged them to do, which was to overthrow the Iraqi regime.
I actually have a clip from a documentary called Web of Deceit. I have like a couple minute clip of that if we want to just add that in for our listeners.
Sure.
Mass graves are evidence of the most massive atrocity of which Saddam is accused, the slaughter of 300,000 Shiites, their remains only now being uncovered. They rose up against the dictator in 1991 after Saddam's defeat in Kuwait and were horrifically repressed. A crime denounced around the globe. But once again, the United States and its allies were complicit in those killings.
The United States had total responsibility for those uprisings. By militarily smashing Saddam Hussein, it created the possibility for the uprisings. And second, the first President Bush on the 15th of February twice called for the Iraqi people to rise up against Saddam Hussein.
That call came with the United States still battling Iraqi forces.
The world will not allow.
President Bush suggested a way to end the conflict, a massive popular revolt.
There's another way for the bloodshed to stop, and that is for the Iraqi military and the Iraqi people to take matters into their own hands, to force Saddam Hussein, the dictator, to step aside.
The president's call was repeatedly broadcast all over Iraq. The uprising was spontaneous, unplanned, and it swept across southern Iraq like wildfire. Many of Saddam's soldiers joined the revolt. Meanwhile, in the north of Iraq, the country's Kurds also launched an uprising. But tragedy was building. Once the U.S. had expelled Saddam from Kuwait, it turned out that George Bush, despite his calls for an uprising, had no serious plans for Iraq at all.
As a result,
at the time, Thomas Pickering was high up in the U.S. government, ambassador to the United Nations.
We had wonderfully prepared combat activities, and we had absolutely no idea about what to do in a post-combat phase.
And there was no policy?
No policy, no real settled interests, no examination of what we should do, no examination of how we should deal with the future, except that we didn't want to go to Baghdad.
Deploying hundreds of thousands of troops without any idea what you're going to do?
Yep. Fairly convincingly so.
How could that have happened?
Well, it happened 13 years later. Why ask the question about 1991?
Same thing now.
Yeah.
So back in 1991, when the peace treaty was signed, the Americans forbid the Iraqis from flying their planes, but allowed them to keep using their helicopters. Helicopters which the Iraqis then used with deadly effect against the uprising. How do you explain, then, these calls for an uprising on the part of the United States?
All of the efforts to debilitate Saddam and to create problems for him in order to remove him from Kuwait were justified.
Even though the U.S. couldn't follow up afterwards to help these people who rose up?
In war and love, all's fair.
So that's the clip that I pulled out, which I think, do you find it accurate?
Well, not only do I find it accurate, but I find it appalling that Thomas Pickering would take such an utterly casual attitude.
Yeah, and the look on his face at the time, he's kind of like, he knows that it's despicable, but he just it's like, hey,
Yeah,
it was cynical.
And I have, galactically epic problems, with that kind of mentality, because the plain fact of the matter is, it would have been a very simple matter for the United States, with not a huge amount of effort and not an enormous amount of planning, to have actually been in a position to facilitate those uprisings and to ensure that they were successful. And there were two ways that could have been achieved. One, the CIA could have been tasked from day one to make contact with Kurdish and Shiite rebel leaders, folks who were absolutely committed to getting rid of Saddam Hussein. And a covert action plan could have been developed to assist those rebels, to get them the arms they needed, and also to have the United States provide the necessary air support and air cover. And that could have been achieved through the use of U.S. Special Operations teams that could have been attached to Iraqi and Kurdish guerrilla formations and military formations, who then could have called in the airstrikes necessary in order to deal with both the helicopters, also the air-to-air cover that would have been required too, to make sure that the Iraqi military helicopters were dealt with but also to call the necessary airstrikes to take care of the remaining armored and mechanized capability of the loyalists of Saddam's regime. So this would not have been a remotely heavy lift on the part of the United States. It would not have required anything approaching the number of troops that were employed either in Operation Desert Storm or subsequently in 2003, when the United States made the mistake of actually going into Iraq wholesale and trying to remake the country in its own image, essentially. But I think that for a minimum amount of effort, an enormous amount of goodwill could have been generated among the Kurdish and Shiite populations. From a geostrategic standpoint, it would have been a little bit of a mixed bag because we would have angered our erstwhile Turkish allies by providing that kind of support and assistance to the Kurds. But by the same token, if we had been as helpful to the Shiites in southern Iraq as I believe we should have been, it would have given us an ability to kind of create a real wedge between those Iraqi Shiites and the Iranian regime itself. It would have made the task of trying to contain Iran a much easier affair going forward. But instead, the United States, at President Bush's direction, committed an act of national cowardice and betrayal in calling on those folks to engage in that uprising and then leaving them to be annihilated. And it only allowed Saddam Hussein to hang on for longer. It made the process of trying to actually ensure that Iraq was cleansed of nuclear, biological, chemical, and ballistic missile capabilities all the harder. All these things would have been facilitated and accelerated. Iraq's disarmament in those categories could have been accelerated by the kind of plan that I'm talking about. So it was an amazing act of incompetence and cowardice, and it will absolutely be my strongest memory of George Bush, 41 to the day that I die, George Herbert Walker Bush.
Do you think that was him or the people around him? Did he have one or two advisors who he leaned on strongly, or did he have his own strong ideas about what he did and didn't want to do?
No, I'm sure it was a mix of things, but neither Powell nor Cheney had any desire to go to Baghdad, and of course, that's understandable, and that's not something that I would have advocated, and I've never advocated that. But I think that when the President of the United States calls upon an oppressed people to rise up, that creates the expectation that the United States is going to pay more than lip service support to any subsequent effort to throw off a dictatorial regime. Right. And I have an old-fashioned sense of honor and fair play, and I guess that kind of makes me passé in today's Washington. But that's just exactly how I look at these things, and I think that I worry about and did worry about and continue to worry about the precedent that it's set. And of course, the other slice of this that we haven't talked about, but I think I'll kind of begin the conversation on it now, is the other effect of the war was to draw the United States even closer to these corrupt, Sunni-dominated regimes in the Persian Gulf, and Saudi Arabia, of course, being at the top of the list, but also Bahrain, which has a minority Sunni government that ruthlessly suppresses its Shiite majority population. The United States established its Fifth Fleet headquarters in Manama on Bahrain, and we're about as far in bed with that regime as we could possibly be, which I think, again, is just a catastrophic geopolitical mistake, and it's also an immoral act. Go ahead.
Did this? I actually pulled a paragraph out of your Just Security article. You say, quote, "The final legacy of Bush's diplomatic work during and after the war was to draw the United States ever closer to the brutal, corrupt regimes that reside on the Arabian Peninsula. The most vicious of all is the mammoth of the two Bush rescued with Operation Desert Storm, a fact driven home by Saudi Arabia's barbaric, American-supported war in Yemen and its murder of journalist Jamal Khashoggi." I was not aware that the first Iraq War sort of strengthened or cemented or changed our relationship with Saudi Arabia and the other Are you saying that we established those bases because of the Iraq War, for example, the Bahrain?
Yes,
and
absolutely.
also Qatar?
Yes. It's absolutely all the expansion of U.S. military capability in the region flows directly from that war. And just to kind of give our listeners a little bit of background here, for the longest time, our relationship with Saudi Arabia especially was what's best described as a transactional relationship. We would buy their oil, and in turn they would buy arms from us. And that's really kind of how the relationship worked for the longest period of time. And of course, the Al Saud family, they hold themselves up as being the, quote, protectors or keepers of the two holy mosques in Islam in Mecca and Medina. And so the idea, essentially, that they would allow non-Muslim military personnel, especially, to set foot in Saudi Arabia was something that they had never contemplated. They had never remotely thought about that, and I'm sure had no desire to do it even on August 5th, 1990. But they were faced with the reality that Saddam Hussein had committed 120,000 of his very best and most experienced troops that were experienced in the use of chemical warfare, troops that had a large and relatively capable, by regional standards, Air Force in a position to back them up. And it would have been a relatively simple matter for them to roll into the eastern province of Saudi Arabia and overrun it. And that's essentially where all the major oil facilities are in Saudi Arabia. So, it wasn't just an economic threat that King Fahd and his advisors were looking at. It was an absolute threat to their survival as a regime. So they really didn't have any choice but to allow the United States, to come in and the rest of the coalition essentially to come in and do it. And the United States used it as an opportunity to begin setting up these bases. We have fewer of them in Saudi Arabia today than we've had in the past, but nevertheless, we've expanded our relationships with a lot of the other Gulf states, and particularly Bahrain, and that's given us a massive military footprint, essentially, in that part of the world. And it was that 1991 Persian Gulf War that opened the door to that.
Okay. Yeah, that's really significant. I just figured we had those bases for a really long time. I had not. I mean, obviously, I knew that we built up bases, to fight those wars. But that's very interesting. Now, Bush's administration, Dick Cheney is his Secretary of Defense, and Paul Wolfowitz is the Undersecretary, I believe. Now, Wes Clark says something in 2007 when he's running for president. He says a lot of things about the Iraq War, but he says one thing that I found to be particularly interesting, and I have a clip here of that. He's at the Commonwealth Club. It's in 2007.
It came back to me, a 1991 meeting I had with Paul Wolfowitz. In 2001, he was Deputy Secretary of Defense, but in 1991, he was the Undersecretary of Defense for Policy. It's the number 3 position in the Pentagon. And I had gone to see him when I was a 1-star general. I was commanding the National Training Center. I had met him one time. He said, if you ever get to Washington, come look me up. They always say that. Well, I was there in Washington. It was a Friday afternoon. I'd visited Colin Powell. He'd given me 5 minutes of his precious time and sent me on my way, and I was bored in the Pentagon. And I thought, I'll just go, who can I see? I think I'll see Wolfowitz. So I called, and up there, he was available. Scooter Libby came to the door. I met Scooter for the first time, and he brought me in. And I said to Paul, and this is 1991, I said, Mr. Secretary, you must be pretty happy with the performance of the troops in Desert Storm. And he said, well, yeah, he said, but not really. He said, because the truth is we should have gotten rid of Saddam Hussein, and we didn't. And this was just after the Shia uprising in March of 91, which we had provoked, and then we kept our troops on the sidelines and didn't intervene. And he said, but one thing we did learn, he said, we learned that we can use our military in the region, in the Middle East, and the Soviets won't stop us. He said, and we've got about 5 or 10 years to clean up those old Soviet client regimes, Syria, Iran, Iraq, before the next great superpower comes on to challenge us. And it was like, I'm coming out of the Mojave Desert. I'm been training troops. I haven't been thinking geostrategy for some time. And suddenly a guy just sort of shoves this nugget at you. Well, you remember it. It was a pretty stunning thing. You mean the purpose of the military is to start wars and change governments? It's not to sort of deter conflict? We're going to invade countries? And, my mind was spinning. And I put that aside. It was like a nugget that you hold on to. This country was taken over by a group of people with a policy coup. Wolfowitz and Cheney and Rumsfeld, and you could name a half dozen other collaborators from the Project for a New American Century. They wanted us to destabilize the Middle East, turn it upside down, make it under our control. It went back to those comments in 1991.
So he was doing a little campaigning there too, but this is part of a bigger conversation where he says that right after 9/11, he goes to the Pentagon and an officer tells him what the plans are, that we're going to invade Iraq. And not only that, we're going to invade 7 countries in 5 years. This is pretty infamous speech that Wes Clark, he made this, he told this story numerous times. In fact, I saw him tell it myself in person at a campaign rally for Joe Sestak in this same time period. I guess the big thing is the whole idea that Wolfowitz had in mind, a much bigger thing. Now, I don't know if he's just starting to think of this because the Soviet Union is, just falling and they're sort of thinking about all the big ideas and the things they could do. But at the same time that Wolfowitz is thinking this way, assuming that this is true, of course it's hearsay, but, they're also doing this military-based build-up that you talk about. The other thing that strikes me is, one, I'm not 100% convinced that we didn't help provoke Saddam. I'm not completely convinced that we didn't help that along. But the other thing is that at one point in time, Saddam Hussein, got cold feet, and he's like, okay, I'll back off, and he's ready to talk. And apparently, according to some experts I've heard here and there, there were ways that we probably could have prevented this whole thing, or we could have definitely calmed this thing down, given Saddam a face-saving solution so that he would back off. And nobody seemed interested in doing that. So I do have to wonder if the things that we're seeing today, the bigger Middle East plan, if that was kind of already in the plans of it. I don't get the sense that Bush had those kind of plans, but his certainly people in his cabinet did. So I find that whole thing to be kind of confusing.
Well, I would go back to something that General Clark referenced, which was this project on the New American Century, or PNAS. And some very, very infamous neocons like Wolfowitz, like Richard Pearl, others, were very heavily involved in drawing up what could really only be described essentially as a neo-imperial blueprint for the United States in a post-Soviet world, right? That's really what that whole thing was fundamentally about. And I think what you had when the war was over, when the 1991 war, when the ceasefire went into effect, is Wolfowitz and other fellow travelers who shared that vision suddenly saw that they had an opportunity, to try to move that idea forward. Now, by the same token, I will tell you, having worked very extensively in providing intelligence support for the unified and specified commands, the military's job, kind of on a year in and year out basis, is to plan for bad things that may happen. And the foundation for that really essentially is war planning. It is contingency planning. And so you take a look at a particular operations plan that you might have to execute, if country X invades country Y and country Y has some kind of real relationship with the United States, what do you need to be able to do essentially in order to be able to support country Y and try to turn the situation around, if it comes to essentially a military confrontation. And the United States going into Desert Shield really did not have that kind of a plan to deal with Iraq, which is why so much of it wound up being a kind of a military version of a pickup basketball game in some respects. And it took a long time, essentially, to get a lot of forces into theater and so on and so forth. But in the wake of that, in the wake of the war, there was a lot more intensified planning by the United States Central Command, or CENTCOM, but also by the U.S. European Command, or EUCOM, which has responsibility for Turkey and essentially the Levant, what we would refer to as the Levant, so Lebanon, Syria, Jordan, and pretty much that area, in addition to portions of North Africa. So an awful lot of additional post-war planning was taking place in what I would call kind of a traditional military framework. This kind of contingency planning, war planning, it goes back over a century. This is essentially how all kind of really big modern militaries of major states do business, if you will, from a military standpoint. What I would say with respect to Wolfowitz and the neocons and all the rest of that is that there's no doubt that they had a particular agenda, and they weren't able to realize it. They weren't able to try to put it fully into action because George Herbert Walker Bush lost re-election, obviously. And then you had this interregnum, this 8-year interregnum of the Clinton administration, in which a somewhat different approach is taken to the region. When Madeleine Albright became Secretary of State, she kind of initiated this concept of so-called dual containment, which involved trying to keep Iraq or Iran from becoming a major threat. And I'll tell you that, when I was at the CIA at NPIC in the wake of the Gulf War, the talk immediately turned to Iran, as Iran being the next threat. And I spent a lot of time working that particular military problem, and I talk about that in a fair amount of detail in my memoir. But most of that, again, really kind of represented a lot of standard, inside the Beltway, State Department and DOD thinking on a lot of this stuff. So in other words, it was very institutional in many respects. And for the most part, foreign policy was not really what Bill Clinton and his team wanted to spend an awful lot of time on, right? I mean, they wanted to be able to do things with the economy, with healthcare, with a whole series of other domestic priorities. So in a lot of respects, the bureaucracy in that period of time was able to kind of go off and largely do its own thing until Al-Qaeda started to become a real threat, a real problem. And that really became an issue during Clinton's second term. But I think, as I indicated earlier, there's no doubt in my mind that the decision of Saudi Arabia and the other Gulf states to allow the United States and the coalition to come in and establish permanent or semi-permanent bases really did fundamentally alter the dynamic. It really did change the dynamic in some very, very dramatic ways. And that's why we continue to be so mired, essentially, in the Persian Gulf region and on the Arabian Peninsula, and the deepening of that relationship, with Saudi Arabia is what has given the Saudis essentially a green light to engage in this very hideous, bloody proxy war with Iran in Yemen. And we are backing the Saudis, and as a result, thousands of people are killed, and maybe many hundreds of thousands, face the possibility of famine, starvation, other forms of just awful kinds of deprivation, because we've gotten into bed with the wrong people for the wrong reasons.
Yeah, it's for quite a while now. It just seems like we've been on the wrong side of things, and not only are we more entangled with the Saudis, but we seem to have interjected ourselves into these intra-Gulf rivalries, and at this point, I think that it's it's the undercurrent in a lot of the things, particularly that the clash that we've seen over Khashoggi. Um, you know, the whole alignment of Turkey and Qatar and uh, Saudis and the UAE, and we seem to be just completely embedded in that. What look like irreconcilable differences to me, and I'm not
Yes.
quite sure, why we want to be there.
Well, I think once you become an imperial power, and that's really what we are today, we're not truly a functioning democratic republic in kind of the sense that the founders really had in mind. The founders were fundamentally opposed to so-called foreign entanglements and all the rest of that. And for the longest time, of course, the United States didn't have, a large military and a large power projection capability. It wasn't that we had not projected power in the past. We had. You go back to the issue of the Barbary pirates in the late 18th century, early 19th century. It forced President Jefferson to actually, commission a lot more U.S. warships in order to go to the Mediterranean and ensure that we could have freedom of navigation and freedom of the seas for our commercial merchant vessels to be safe to carry goods back and forth between the United States and other countries in the Mediterranean. And it helped to result in the creation of the United States Marine Corps and gave the United States an initial, albeit relatively limited, power projection capability. But that was really, for the most part, the exception, for the better part of several decades. And it wasn't until you began to see this really major expansion of the United States out through the rest of the North American continent over the course of the balance of the 19th century, interrupted, of course, by the Civil War. It wasn't until that was really over that the United States began to kind of develop both the political and the technical capability to really become a global power. And it all really goes back to the Spanish-American War. I mean, that was one of the most watershed events in American history, because we went from being essentially a Western Northern Hemisphere power kind of overnight to being a de facto global power. We acquired these possessions through conquest, not just in the Caribbean, but obviously across the Pacific. And that was when we really began to kind of see the rise of a lot of these trends that would ultimately go on to create what I think we can safely call an American empire today. So it's been over a century, essentially, of this on-again, off-again quest to develop the ability to try to control the world around us diplomatically, economically, and if necessary, militarily. And it reaches the tipping point, of course, with World War II, and everything that happened after that. That really, for the United States, I think, marks the genuine beginning of the imperial age. Once fascist Italy and Nazi Germany and imperial Japan are defeated, the United States has become this colossus, and only the Soviets really have the ability to even rival us when it comes to power. And for the longest time, even they really couldn't. They certainly couldn't rival us militarily for the longest time.
They could deter, yeah.
Yeah, they were the only ones that were really credibly in a position to kind of to pose any kind of a serious challenge to the United States. And of course, the Soviet regime was absolutely a predatory one. There was really no question about that. No question about that at all. But the United States, as conceived by the founders, was supposed to be a democratic republic. It was not supposed to be an empire. It was not supposed to be a country seeking to impose its will, diplomatic, economic, or militarily, on any other state. We sought, in the eyes of the founders at least, in the vision that they had, to be essentially a first among equals, and attempt to be a friend to all, to the extent that that would be possible. But that's all been lost. That's all been washed away. And we have this imperial tribalism that I think in many respects Donald Trump really is like the ultimate manifestation of in so many ways, in so many ugly ways. And I really fear for the future of this country if we don't have the kind of reckoning that I think is necessary in order to give us the course correction that is required in order to at least give us a chance of getting back on the path to trying to restore a functioning democratic republic.
Yeah, I think if we don't pull back in and change course, I think that our fate is the same as all the other empires that we've seen. I think it's really interesting that you bring up, the fact that you want to make a point that we are an imperial power, we behave like one, and we just are one now. But throughout my adult life, nobody talked about the American empire. Nobody saw us in that light. I mean, that's why I'm doing this podcast, is when I came to that realization myself, I became sort of fixed on that subject. And your citing of the Spanish-American War, I'm glad you did that. That's the second time in the past week or so that someone that I respect has made that point. Danny Shorson has an article about 1898, the year of 1898, and all the things that happened and that turning point, that pivot point that I was not aware of, frankly. But the war in Syria also seems to have just pulled back the curtain on a lot of things, including the fact that we are an empire. And I wonder, I see it everywhere. I hear it in conversations, I see it in articles, and I wonder if that realization is going to change anything. Because one of the things that's interesting in Wolfowitz's quote is that at that point in time, he realizes that there's only a window of opportunity. He realizes that another global power is going to rise up. But since that point in time, they all seem to have changed their minds. Now that they've had a taste of being a sole superpower, they don't want to let that go. They don't want to go to a multipolar world. And frankly, I think that is the biggest threat to all of us. I mean, the whole world, is the fact that they can't accept the fact that sole superpower is not a sustainable situation, that there always was going to be a window of opportunity. That window's over. We're now, there are other powers rising up and frankly pushing back against our foreign policy. But there seems to be a stubborn group of powerful people who are not willing to make that concession.
Well, I think what they really failed to grasp is that America's ability to actually really influence events around the world and to truly have an impact, for good or for ill, traditionally flowed not from the barrel of the gun, but flowed from our factories and our workers. And America has, in so many ways, ceased to be a maker of things other than, in many respects, weapons of war. And it's that economic hollowing out. And there are a lot of reasons, that it's happened. I mean, I don't think it's as quite as cut and dried and simplistic as some of my progressive friends, want to make it out to be. But it's also not the shining, massive success that a lot of free traders, I think, want to make it out to be either. I think
right.
I think globalization has been a mixed bag. In some respects, it has absolutely improved choices and quality of life for a slice of the American population, right? But in other respects, the failure of both management and labor in America to kind of adapt, to the fact that we do live on this planet and that we do essentially have kind of this large functioning global economy, that the failure to properly adapt to that has kind of helped to put us in this position. But this constant feeding of a massive, largely unnecessary, and certainly radically overpriced military establishment, national security state establishment, it is a massive drain on the U.S. Treasury. And it is also, not a productive use of taxpayer dollars for the most part, right? I mean, if you build an F-35 fighter, assuming it actually functions correctly, it sits on an airfield, right? And pilots train with it, and maybe if you have to, you go to war with it. Whereas if you build a 737 and an airline buys it, an awful lot of jobs are created through that. An opportunity for travel is created through that. So I like to draw those kinds of comparisons, when I talk about the real, economic cost, essentially, of this massive national security state. And that's the other thing that the founders never intended. They never intended. In fact, they were, especially the anti-federalist.
Yeah, they opposed it.
Yeah, which is pretty much how I view myself. I view myself as pretty much a 21st century anti-federalist. They were absolutely opposed to a large standing army because that was one of the things that we had rebelled against
Exactly.
in the Revolutionary War. And so the fact that we have this, relatively large military establishment and this massive power projection capability and so on and so forth, when we really don't have a legitimate need for it anymore. I mean, you've talked about, some of the other powers that are at least, nominally on the rise. Although I think in the case of China and India, for example, who would be the two big countries I'd be looking at, they've got their own problems. And I think for the Chinese government especially, the bell is going to toll sooner or later because a lot of their policies are ultimately themselves, unsustainable. They're engaged essentially in a global competition with us in many respects, and engaging in debt leveraging schemes in Panama and elsewhere in the world to try to essentially buy influence and buy access to port facilities and things of that nature. And in the end, they're going to overextend themselves as well. And I think they're going to make a lot of the same mistakes that we have. They've certainly made a lot of the same mistakes we have with respect to industrialization and not showing due diligence with respect to environmental protection and proper environmental protection and things of that nature. But I think the United States has a national security establishment that is oversized, it's overpriced, it's not nearly as competent as most people necessarily think. And I think in many respects that's because standards have slipped. And I think there needs to be a fundamental reevaluation. It's the kind of reevaluation that should have taken place after the Berlin Wall came down. And to be fair, under President Bush 41, there was a downsizing. There were some changes that were initiated, but those changes essentially were semi-arrested during the Clinton administration. And of course, when Bush 43 was elected president, they were reversed.
Right.
And you saw, massive increases in defense spending. Of course, a lot of that's, is post 9/11. It's like we have to gear up for this fight and so on and so forth. But the reality is an awful lot of the money that was spent on things that we simply didn't need. And we just see that, I think, over and over again. A lack of competition in defense procurement, a great example. The F-35 program is one of my favorite targets. There was never the kind of competition that needed to take place there. I think a lot of American defense manufacturers are essentially crony capitalists. They look for the opportunity to be protected essentially from real competition from foreign sources. And I think these are all things ultimately that need to change, because the amount of money that we're spending on defense, so-called defense, is literally killing us economically. It is not sustainable. It is unnecessary. And ultimately, it's counterproductive from an economic standpoint. We need to be focused on creating jobs, real jobs in this country. And I don't mean minimum wage jobs. I'm talking about real manufacturing jobs. We need to
let's make things again.
We need to see a revitalization of the American manufacturing sector. And I'm not talking about this just in dollars and cents terms. I'm also talking about it in terms of social stability, right? One of the reasons that Donald Trump is president is because people within the socioeconomic class that I came out of, which was the working poor in Southwest Missouri, people that come out of the blue collar socioeconomic realm, these people have seen their standard of living go to hell in a handbasket over the course of the last 30 or 40 years. There are a lot of reasons for it. I don't think that you can automatically necessarily put the onus on any one specific one. There may be some that you can say have had more of an impact than others. But the reality is these people feel like they are losers now. They feel like they have been shut out of any prospect of being able to have a decent home, have a decent retirement, be able to take the occasional vacation, much less have the ability to put their kids through college if their kids want to go to college or technical schools or whatever, right? And when people are frustrated in that way, and it goes on year after year after year, it creates a level of political rage and instability that leads folks to begin to go down paths politically that they otherwise might not go.
Exactly.
And I think in a lot of respects, that really helps to explain Donald Trump's rise and his success, is that the existing Democratic and Republican national parties have run this country into the ground. They have failed to address kind of the core issues that affect everyday, workaday Americans, folks, that go into that $40,000 to, let's say, $75,000 annual income range. Those folks do not believe that the American dream is still there for them. And that's exactly why we have so much of this political rage and anger and sense of alienation. And it's not all of it. I mean, there's definitely a xenophobic, racist element to Donald Trump's base. We've all seen it on television. We've all seen it on social media. We've seen it in a number of places. But I really do believe that a huge chunk of Trump's support comes from folks who would have, in a previous era, been called Reagan Democrats, right? These are people who just feel like essentially the two existing major political parties completely left them behind, completely forgot about them, do not really give a damn ultimately about what happens to them. And I think that unless we have a real kind of political reckoning and awakening, we could wind up, unfortunately, seeing more demagogues like Trump down the road. I mean, he's certainly, in many respects, the most dangerous man to hold the Oval Office next to Richard Nixon in my lifetime. And Nixon, I would at least give credit for having some real intelligence and having some savvy and actually having some accomplishments that he can point to. Nixon, of course, was his own worst enemy in the end, which is why he was nearly impeached. But he did have the intelligence to open the dialogue with the Chinese communists and essentially drive a wedge, in between the two major communist powers of the day. And I think that put us on the road, ultimately, to a lot of the positive changes that we saw take place in the 80s and the 90s especially. But we don't have, leaders with that kind of vision right now.
Well, they're doing the opposite, Pat. I mean, they're driven the Russian and the Chinese into what looks like a pretty strong alliance with the NATO expansion and, the more recent obsessive aggression toward Russia. So they're actually doing the opposite of what one of the good things that Nixon achieved.
And I don't want to downplay our problem, with Vladimir Putin, because I think we have a real problem with Putin, and I think that a lot of that problem is of Putin's making. But by the same token, it's important to remember that even during this extremely dangerous edge of nuclear oblivion confrontation that we had with the Soviets, for decades, after the Cuban Missile Crisis, successive American presidents and successive Russian leaders, Soviet leaders, began to kind of move in a different direction. And this is how we got the Comprehensive Test Ban Treaty. It's how we got SALT I. It's how we got détente. It's how we began to essentially walk back from the brink of potentially catastrophic, potentially world-ending confrontation. And again, that is not the kind of leadership that we have in Washington today. I mean, Trump is the extreme manifestation, if you will, of the uneducated kind of troglodytic demagogue, right? But we've had a lot of people, both in the White House and in the Congress, in the Senate and in the House, who've helped to kind of pave the way for this guy, who have been, demagogues themselves and who have not taken their responsibilities as public servants seriously. And I've seen this just so much in the course of the 30 plus years I've been in Washington now. You have a different, generally lower class of politician today. They tend to be much more narcissistic. They tend to be much more, what's in it for me. And I'm not saying that to some degree politicians haven't always been that way, but we've had plenty of statesmen in the history, statespeople especially in the history of our country, who have served in the House and the Senate. And I'm talking about people like Arthur Vandenberg on the Republican side, and people like Robert La Follette Sr., another progressive Republican. And then we've had folks like Ted Kennedy. A lot of my conservative friends, of course, consider him to be anathema, but in many ways, Kennedy really was a great statesman. And that's why when he passed from the Senate, it really did kind of mark the end of an era in a lot of respects, because Kennedy was a guy that did think in very big terms and was looking essentially for ways to kind of, move the public policy ball forward. You may not have agreed with his particular policy choices, but he had a real concern and care for the Senate as an institution and the Congress as an institution. And we simply don't see that level of dedication, that level of concern about the first branch of government. And that's another reason why Donald Trump is able to get as far as he has. We just don't have, enough serious people. And I certainly don't consider Adam Schiff, the incoming chairman of the House Intelligence Committee, to remotely be a serious person any more than I consider Devin Nunes to be a serious person. They've both been, partisan tribal warriors, for their particular side, and there really hasn't been Nunes. I would say, more so. Certainly, he's definitely been in the tank for the president. There's no doubt about that. But I find it extremely disturbing, to just give you one example with respect to Mr. Schiff. I find it extremely disturbing that I haven't been able to find a single public statement by Mr. Schiff about the revelation that Senator Grassley provided us at the beginning of November, that my former employer, the Central Intelligence Agency, had been monitoring the communications of CIA whistleblowers with congressional staff and with the Intelligence Community Inspector General. Let me make sure that I've kind of framed this correctly for our listeners. The CIA was spying on members of Congress and their staff who were communicating with people inside the CIA, who were trying to communicate waste, fraud, abuse, mismanagement, and possibly criminal conduct, issues related to those problems.
They were trying to intercept, right? Before
they were intercepting those communications. And from what I've been able to gather, there was retaliation that took place as a result. Now, when I'm kind of looking at two issues here, alleged and to a certain degree, I think, somewhat proven Russian interference in our elections, on the one hand, and the Central Intelligence Agency spying on members of Congress and staff and trying to thwart, essentially, oversight, what do I consider to be the greater threat? For me, it's not even a close call. It's the CIA spying on... I expect the Russians to do what the Russians are doing, right? I expect them to do that. They've been doing it for 100 years. I've got some wonderful stuff. I'm doing a third book, as I think I mentioned in our online conversations, that kind of looks at this whole phenomenon of domestic surveillance and political repression, going back literally to the Spanish-American War. And going through State Department records earlier this year, I came across correspondence that J. Edgar Hoover, in his very first year as head of the Bureau of Investigation, what would ultimately be called the FBI, communications that he had sent to the Secretary of State in the Republican-controlled Coolidge administration, passing along gossip and or dirt on President Coolidge's political rival for the presidency, Senator Robert La Follette Sr. And these are allegations that the Soviets were trying to basically support La Follette's campaign. They were telling their people in the United States to vote for La Follette, to campaign for La Follette, and give money to La Follette, and all the rest of this. And so the White House basically wants more of this. They want more data. And so the Soviets have been at this. The Russians have been at this, for a long time. To me, it's not news. It's one of those things that you should ultimately expect. I'm not saying you blow it off. But what I am saying is that when the Central Intelligence Agency, which is supposed to be concerned with preventing Pearl Harbors or preventing 9/11s, is instead spending its time spying on its employees who are trying to communicate waste, fraud, abuse, and possible criminal conduct allegations.
And can Congress. I say to cover themselves, in my view.
Yeah, there's really something wrong, and I have not seen Mr. Schiff make a single public statement about this. All I see Adam Schiff talk about all the time is Donald Trump and Russiagate, and that's, as the chairman, the incoming chairman of that committee, his responsibility. And those committees now have existed for 40 years. This is the 40th anniversary. This year is the 40th anniversary of the creation of the House and Senate Intelligence Committees. Their job is to prevent the CIA from doing exactly what Senator Grassley exposed that they were doing at the beginning of November of 2018. So we've got, I think, some really huge congressional oversight lapses and issues that really ought to be at the top of the agenda at the beginning of 2019. And whether any of that, will actually change in January, I just don't know.
I see zero chance of that happening. I see people like Schiff, and he's not the only one, just completely aligned and allied with the intelligence agencies. I mean, I tend to pay attention to what John Brennan says. If you listen to what John Brennan says and what Adam Schiff, they're almost parroting each other. Yes. And if you look at what my former allies in the Democratic Party are doing, I mean, I don't see a difference between their position and the position of the intelligence agencies, who seem to be quite obsessed with covering up their activities, current and former. And I think that's a big problem. In fact, that it's really kind of an understatement to say it's a big problem. So I agree with you. The point you're making.
Yeah, I think, again, to me, it's a manifestation of this utterly toxic political tribalism that we suffer from right now. When the FBI was investigating former Secretary of State Hillary Clinton's misuse of a personal email account for official business and all the rest of that, Democratic operatives were just, foaming at the mouth that Comey was essentially the Antichrist and so on and so forth.
Right.
And the pivot, was just absolutely amazing to see. Once this whole issue of Trump and alleged or actual collusion, yet to actually be proven, at least with respect to the Russians, became, a real thing. When it really began to kind of get legs, then you saw this massive pivot to suddenly the FBI and the CIA were just, they were apple pie and, all American and so on and so forth with respect to progressives. And, Glenn Greenwald, I think, has done overall a very good job of kind of pointing this stuff out. He was on Twitter the same day, I was, with respect to the late President Bush 41, making the point about this hagiographic nonsense about Bush's time in power and so on and so forth. And he talked about the political tribalism aspect of it. And it's all true. I mean, it's all just so true. And it's so toxic. You can't, it's hard to imagine, essentially, today, finding enough Republicans on the House Judiciary Committee to vote for articles of impeachment against Donald Trump, if sufficient evidence, were presented, essentially, to kind of justify that. And I should remind our listeners that, the impeachment mechanism doesn't rest on proving criminality necessarily. I mean, that certainly can be a factor, but it doesn't have to be based on criminality. We look back at Watergate, of course, and Nixon's starting of the so-called plumbers unit in the White House, and going after Dan Ellsberg and trying to break into Brookings and get some incriminating documents out of their safe, and so on and so forth. All this kind of stuff. Those obviously were criminal acts. Those were felonies, and they were directed. And that's kind of how we think of these things. But a president can be impeached for being unfit to hold the office. A president can be removed, essentially, if enough members of Congress decide that his continuation in office actually represents a real mortal danger to the functioning of our democratic order and to our system of government. So I have to say that I find it difficult to imagine a circumstance like we had in 1974, when you actually had 7 Republicans on the House Judiciary Committee vote with the Democrats on articles of impeachment to get Nixon. I'm not sure that you could find 1 Republican, 2 Republicans, on the House Judiciary Committee right now, who would actually go in that direction. And to be fair, I'll also say that I think you'd need very different leadership in the Democratic Party. You would need more adult leadership than Nancy Pelosi and some of the people that she has surrounded herself with. I'm not sure that Mr. Nadler of New York, who is the incoming chairman of the House Judiciary Committee, I'm not sure he's the guy by temperament who would really be best equipped to potentially lead an impeachment movement, essentially, on the Judiciary Committee. I think you need some folks who are less partisan bomb throwers and more serious legislators.
Yeah, and I mean, there's a history now. I mean, they've been talking about impeachment before Trump was even installed in office. Yeah. It's not going to be taken seriously by a large percentage of the population, myself included. I mean, I hated the Starr investigation. I hate the Mueller investigation just as much. That's not the subject of this podcast. But I wish that the Democrats would refocus on the people who elected them and on, putting up a candidate who's best for the people and best for the country, and focus on that rather than these political stunts, which I don't think they'll do anyone in this country any good. I wish they would just back off, but they are relentless, and I have a lot of ideas about what's really driving that, but for another time. But yeah, I think we're on the same page. I came up a different side of the political spectrum than you did, but I consider myself independent now, and certainly more in line with people whose political history is just entirely different than mine. And not even just people who came up have similar history as you do. So
I've traveled a very interesting path. Ronald Reagan was the first Republican president that I voted for, and George Herbert Walker Bush was the last.
Yeah.
I voted for Obama the first time out, but within the first 90 days of his presidency, I soured because he didn't appoint Don Johnson to be the head of the Office of Legal Counsel, which I thought was an act of political cowardice, and he did not listen to Greg Craig, his White House counsel, on the need to just move swiftly to shut down Guantanamo and to put that whole episode behind us. And when he failed to hold anybody accountable for the CIA's torture program, I mean, he lost me, and that's why I did not vote for him in 2012 and in 2016.
Or for the financial crash.
Yeah,
we're still paying the price.
Yes. And, in 2016, I voted for Gary Johnson because he admitted he didn't know where Aleppo, Syria was. And I thought, well, it means he can't bomb it. I'm at the point in my life where, as I said, I think of myself, I think in most respects, as kind of a 21st century anti-federalist. And more often than not, I just think of myself as an angry old man. I'm just really, I'm tired of people not taking government seriously. I'm tired of them not taking governance seriously, because that's exactly how democracies die at the end of the day. When the whole process is trivialized, when it's turned into a narcissistic,
corrupt,
tribal sideshow, then people don't go and vote. People get turned off, and they feel like, what's the point, and so on. And there are too many people that have fought and bled and died, whether it's been overseas or right here in our own streets, to try to create, a more just and a freer society, for everybody, and to see what's going on these days. For me, it's not so much dispiriting as it is just a real source of tremendous anger. But it's also motivation for me to continue to do what I do, which is, write and speak out to the extent that I can. And forums like this one are a great opportunity to do that. And I'm very grateful for it.
Yeah, I don't know what the big answer is to the big problem, but I know that one of the small things that I can do is to just try to tell the truth as I know it and as I see it, and talk to other people, find other people who have similar goals. And that's what we're doing. So anything else you want to cover? I have some other questions in here, but I think I don't think they're that important. I think we covered a lot of ground, and I really appreciate coming onto the show and enjoyed talking with you. And if you would, well, first of all, if you'd like to make any last points, please do. But also, please tell everyone where they can find your work and how they can support your work and such.
Sure. No, I think I would just, kind of sum up by saying that despite an awful lot of the negative trends that we see, an awful lot of the insane divisiveness and the hate that you often see on social media, there are still a lot of good, decent people in this country who I think kind of share the desire that you and I have for something much better and something much more civilized. And even if we disagree from time to time on maybe specific points here or there, I think we kind of share the basic vision of trying to have a society that's freer and more just, and where there's greater opportunity essentially for everybody. And I think the way that you get there is by fighting, these negative trends that we see, these reactionary trends that we see, these regressive trends that we see.
Mm-hmm.
And I try to do that, through my work at the Cato Institute. And if you simply, Google Patrick Eddington, Cato Institute, the very first link that should come up should be to my bio page. And you'll find essentially everything that I've written while at Cato there. You'll also see our multimedia section. So the events that I've hosted or been a part of, you can also find those there. Any of the podcasts that Cato has done that I've participated in, you'll find that there as well. You can also find me, on the web at a couple of different places. I have a website, patrickeddington.com. But I also have a blog. I haven't maintained it as much over the last few years because I have the Cato outlet for it. But it's called longstrangejourney.com, and it's a direct takeoff of the title of my 2011 memoir, Long Strange Journey. And I tend to put most of my meditations about politics and kind of the legacy of the 1991 Gulf War on that blog. So you can certainly find me there. And my memoir, of course, is available via Amazon. It's also available via the iBook store. If you happen to be into digital stuff, it's also available via Kindle. And I will, as I said, have another book coming out. It'll probably be in the fourth quarter of 2021. And the working title of that is The Triumph of Fear: Domestic Surveillance and Political Repression from McKinley to Trump. It will be published by Georgetown University Press, which is my alma mater and where I actually do teach in the Security Studies program. So that's kind of the commercial. I appreciate the the opportunity, and I certainly hope that we'll have the time to maybe do this again on some other topics.
Yes, I would very much like to do that, particularly the point you brought up about the intervention into the whistleblowing process. And heck, there's a number of different subjects I have teed up for you. So yeah, please do plan to come back.
I'd enjoy it. I'd enjoy it.
Okay. Thank you so much, Patrick. Have a great night.
All right, Joanne. Thank you. You too.
And that's our show. Thank you for listening. Special thanks to Patrick Eddington. Find his work and links to his articles and events at Cato Institute and at his blog, patrickeddington.com. Follow him on Twitter at PGEddington. Around the Empire podcast is independent media brought to you with the help of our donors. You can pitch in at patreon.com/aroundtheempire, or you can do one-time donations on our website, aroundtheempire.com. Follow us on Twitter at aroundtheempire. Helps a lot if you hit the subscribe button on our YouTube channel. That's free. Channel is growing. We still haven't reached the required number of subscribers for revenue-based Super Chat live streams. Also, use the thumbs up to like the individual videos. You can subscribe to our audio podcast on any preferred podcast app. We're on most, if not all of them: iTunes, Apple Podcasts, Spotify, iHeart, Stitcher, Google Music, and all of those. If you like the podcast, take a minute to leave a nice review. It helps a lot. See you next time. Take care, everyone.